Welcome. My name's Jacquie Molloy. I'm responsible for all projects and communications here at Meaningful Aging Australia. And as we begin today's session, let's acknowledge, as always, the traditional custodians of the various lands we are gathering. You can hold them in your mind, or you might like to write them in the chat. For the Melbourne team of Meaningful Aging Australia here on the northern side of Melbourne, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the spiritual strength and resilience of Australia's First Peoples and their deep and enduring connection to country. Welcome to the first episode of Liminal Space, a series of 3 conversations between myself and Lani Morris. Lani, hello.
Hello. How lovely to be with you, and welcome everybody.
Lani, maybe for people who aren't familiar with you, although I know that we're going to have some people here today who know the map of meaning, and the map of meaning, of course, is something that you're responsible for. But perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself so that people understand.
Yeah. Well, I'm Lani Morris. I'm CEO of the Map of Meaning International, which is a charitable trust. And our work is to promote the Map of Meaning, to share it with people. And the Map of Meaning is academic work that was done by Dr. Marjolein Lips-Wiersma, a Dutch woman living in New Zealand, over 20 years ago. And since then, I joined her right at the beginning. And since then, we've developed our understanding of how it captures the way human beings agree we experience meaning, the factors that together give us an experience of meaningful life and meaningful work. And so it's an incredibly simple and incredibly profound framework for thinking about living and all the things that happen in it, including getting older, which is where I first connected up with Meaningful Aging Australia. And we've been working together over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's a joy, to be working with you today, Jackie, and the chance to talk about vulnerability in aging, which we will be today.
And we started this, we had this idea, didn't we, for liminal space. I'll get you to talk a little bit about what we think about liminal space. But we're working on a transitions workshop together, and that you'll be facilitating. And yeah, some of the conversations that we've been having have been so great. We decided, let's carry it over into a public space. So yeah, liminal space, it's a good concept, isn't it?
Well, it's fascinating. I'm really lucky to be part of our Meaningful Aging discussion group, which is just 4 old people sitting around and talking basically on Zoom. But they're pretty splendid old people, as many old people are. And every few weeks we meet and we talk about some particular topic. And this topic of vulnerability came up, and it was such a meaty topic and something I'd never really discussed with others before. And one of my colleagues, Dave Burton, who's also works with the Map of Meaning, said, you know, it's a liminal space. It's a space between the world of vigorous, you could say, maturity and adulthood and death. And that it, in many ways, like aging, it covers a period almost from 60 to more than 100. So we're talking about a huge chunk of our life in which there's shifts and changes, as there are in all periods of our life, but they're ones that often people don't want to look at. You know, they're the ones we don't like the look of. Or as I said to somebody once, you know, if old age was a country, it would be very hard to get tourists going.
Oh my goodness.
That's what I meant by liminal space. You know, it just felt like a lovely way to talk about the transition, which we'll be talking about in our workshop, but also just about the complexity of each person's journey in this space.
Yeah. You know, there's a quote that I wanted to share. People won't be surprised if they've received our newsletter to know that I'm a big fan of David Whyte, who's an Anglo-Irish poet and naturalist and deep spiritual thinker. And this is one of his quotes. He said, like most creatures, we humans go through a periodic molt, except that our molt is an invisible one. And because of the lonely invisibility of the transformation, necessitates a particular form of courage, a courage we are never sure we have in our possession. I love this so much because I think when we're talking about vulnerability, we've got to talk about courage as well. And this image of molting, of letting something go, of shedding, whether it's a natural organic shed or whether it's something you have to make a decision about to shed, I think is, really makes me think about all those various ways that we can be vulnerable.
Look, I love it. And you couldn't have picked an image that closer to my heart. I spent a lot of time as an only child on a farm living in a hen run. I didn't live in the hen run, but, I had deeply identified with birds. So the idea of molting and shedding goes straight to the heart of the matter for me.
Yeah.
But, when I thought about it, when we thought about it, we just thought, how vulnerable older people can be financially. There's a brilliant program on in New Zealand at the moment called The Restaurant That Makes Mistakes. I think it was originally, there was a version done in England, but about dementia. And one of the things that one of the dementia women was saying is people who are in the full flush of their earning in their mid 60s, early 60s, suddenly are without income. And that last 5 to 10 years can make a huge difference financially to people. So financial vulnerability. I live in a retirement village and there are people here who are living on their pension, and it's not a place that would be a comfortable place for many of us. I think, there's physical vulnerability. Suddenly you lose your ability to walk, or slowly you start to stiffen. And, I look at little people jumping off things. The whole idea of being able to bounce, being able to absorb the shock of landing, which was so easy, and now I can't do it. So those things, there's emotional vulnerability, the fear. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm having racing heart or something, and you can feel the vulnerability of that and fear. And then I think I'm not probably the only person awake and frightened tonight. So, that emotional vulnerability, people can lose their communities. I remember my mum at 95, I was the only person really around who knew her when she was not an old person lying in a bed. And our psychic power, our actual sort of force of our energy as beings, we can lose that and become timid and afraid. And we can also technologically become vulnerable because the world is so technologically focused at the moment. And we can't keep up, and if this, I've been so ratty with my mother when she's saying, yes, but could you explain to me once again how to use the whatever it is, took down the notes, and then couldn't make sense of them. And I was so unpleasant to her. And now I look back and think, I can't imagine how stupid I was and how thoughtless. And it's hard to keep asking, so you give up. And what happens, I think, is, as we get old, molting as we are, in all sorts of unexpected ways, in unexpected places, we become vulnerable. And if you think simply in terms of birds, without enough wings, they can't fly. And then they can be pecked to death and they're vulnerable to predators that they could normally fly away from. So we're right to fear, I think, our vulnerability. I think it's a valid thing. And yet what we also noticed in our discussion was how fiercely people hold on to their independence, and that sometimes that may also be problematic.
Yeah.
So interesting, such a rich topic.
It really is. I'd actually forgotten this, and this only happened yesterday, so there you go. But a friend of mine dropped in, and her mother had just been staying with her, and she actually expressed concern about her vulnerability. She said, I don't know whether it's something to worry about, but she seems sort of a bit altered. She seems more vulnerable than she used to be, and I'm not sure why. And I think part of that I'm not sure why is what you were just alluding to with the conversations with your mother, and in retrospect, how you feel about that is like, it's not really so important to know someone else's why they feel vulnerable, but it is important to understand how you're going to meet someone's expression of vulnerability, because that takes courage to be yourself, and to let people see that. So I think, how are you going to meet someone's expression of vulnerability is kind of as important as understanding your own vulnerability, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that term of courage. And I think all living takes courage, but I do think Bette Davis was right, courage, old age is no place for sissies. I look around me, when I first moved in here, I thought, my God, I'm amongst the living dead, and then I met who they are. And now I think I'm privileged to live with people of such courage. And I think there's the 2 points you raise are really important, which is one, how do we meet other people's vulnerability? And Mum was the most important person in my life. And, she was my rock. So for her to be vulnerable, I couldn't tolerate. And I was tough on her, really. And that didn't help her actually be more strong. So it was a totally ineffective strategy. And one that makes me now, and I laugh sometimes, I say, Mum, you got your revenge. I live with thousands, no, I don't, hundreds of old people, most of them women, and I'm really nice to them all in memory of you. So thank you for the lesson. And I'm sorry that you had such a rough time with me. And I was also nice to her when she finally got bedridden. I was really sweet, as long as she wasn't in the house with me. But I think that how do we meet vulnerability of other people? And having that as an honest conversation. So if you do find yourself snapping at your old people, maybe look at what it's bringing up for you, that your father, who's been an extraordinary rock, is suddenly shaky or frightened or crying. How can you be with that, especially if that's not something they've allowed themselves to do before? And how do we meet and encourage vulnerability without allowing them to collapse? Because I think there's a difference between, and I don't mean, if you are genuinely collapsing, it's a different thing. We're not talking about necessarily encouraging people to give up completely and collapse into vulnerability, but to allow vulnerability, to allow molting, to allow letting go, I think becomes at one level one of the great skills and potential gifts of getting older. There's a lot of us around the village who go, I don't care any longer. Like, I'm not trying to maintain this facade.
Yeah.
And there's much more chance to meet people directly where they are at the moment.
Yeah.
I find myself in that, for example, being able to be vulnerable myself more easily, because I know I'm going to be met with an equally authentic response. But there are places, even now, I think, where I would choose how vulnerable I wanted to be. So I think that we were talking a bit, as we were about this, about boundaries, staying conscious enough about when is it wise to be vulnerable and when is it not. And also to prepare, I think, if it's us who's vulnerable, that the first response may not be one that we want. Like, it could be kids are rough with us and you go, okay, yeah, this may be hard for you, but I am actually not who I used to be. Like, have enough strength to go back. And it had Mum said to me, yeah, tough luck, darling. I know I've been the rock for you. I'm still here for you, but I'm not who I used to be.
Not who I used to be.
Opened up a bigger conversation then.
Yeah. And I think, certainly staff in aged care understand the tension around this with families and older people, of the staff see who someone is now. And families can be very resistant to accepting that. I just noticed that Rachel Potter, thank you very much. Rachel's just put a note in the chat that Brene Brown talks about vulnerability being a strength too. And I'm sure everyone is aware of Brene Brown, but she's a research professor. She's actually highly credentialed. She's not just she's not just a TikToker or an Instagram account. But in her research about vulnerability, I know that she has 3 elements that she talks to. That's uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And I think that's, like, we've been talking today really about all of those things: the uncertainty of it, the risk, and needing to know your boundaries, and the emotional exposure for both sides, for the person feeling vulnerable and the person who meets that, because that example you gave of a man who's
Crying for the first
crying
time.
and what to do with that. You need to be able to, I mean, there's a whole lot going on there for the other person, isn't there? Because you need to be able to give permission for someone to be vulnerable and be vulnerable enough to feel authentically yourself, which is, if you weren't scared, it would probably be very empathetic. If this was someone, a loved family member, for example, or dear friend, if you weren't fearful of what them crying meant, the significance of that for who they used to be, and were able to just meet human to human, you would allow the emotional exposure to be one of empathy, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, I think so. And I think, what I'm sort of thinking, even as we talk, is how important it is that we allow our family members to be more than one thing. In the chat, I think, Sally, you've said, the person would always still be themselves if they're saying, I'm not who I used to be. But let's say that person has maintained a strong persona of, I'm the strong one in the family, I'm the chap, or I'm the solo mum, which mum was, and I was a highly volatile and somewhat traumatized child, really, looking back, that had a lot of sort of fake maturity as well as real maturity. So I think she had an incredibly important role as somebody who was stable and sane in my life. And so it was hard. She never cried ever in the time when I was growing up. And it wasn't that she didn't admit vulnerabilities, but I think she knew that if she got wobbly, it might not be very good for me. And she may have been like that anyway, but we never really discussed it. And as she got older, I don't think she did share very much. She didn't, and I didn't ask very much. And I think it was because in some way that was a hard place for us to go. And I sometimes wonder why she lived till she was 95. And then I think it's because she wasn't quite sure I was going to be okay until then. And I think by then it was clear I was going to make it. So what I'm seeing is how important it is if we as parents can have some range in our role and as we're going through time, so that we can let people see our vulnerability and also our strength and our ability to keep learning. And I would say if there was one gift Mum gave me, was that she kept on growing and learning through herself. And that I've passed on to my daughter. And that allows us to go, actually, I'm learning something new now. I'm learning to be vulnerable as part of a constant persona, which is one of learning, not a facade in a sense, I think.
I just want to pause here. I want to make sure that there's some information in the chat for you. Again, one of the reasons why we're holding this series of Liminal Space and having this conversation, and we'll have some other conversations about this in the following two free sessions, is because Lani will be facilitating a workshop around transitions, really the preparation for the best of times and the worst of times, and looking at all the different kinds of transitions, expected and unexpected, that come up through this journey of aging, and looking at what skills will be important and what you might already have experience in without registering or giving yourself kudos for that you've already, by virtue of being alive. If you would like to go on our priority notification list when registrations open for that, please put your email in the chat and we'll make sure that you get all of the information sent to you and a link for registering. So that workshop is different from these free events that we're hosting for you. So that's that. The other thing I would like to do is make sure, I think Marnie is going to put a link in the chat if you haven't already signed up to register for the other 2 in this Liminal Space series, please do, and please share that link widely with your friends. So that would be really terrific to get as many people in this conversation as possible. Lani, one of the things that I have to mention, because it's a bit of a bugbear around vulnerability, comes from my corporate life and leaders who want to be vulnerable. And there's a kind of is it a misunderstanding or a willful misunderstanding? I'm not sure about what it actually means to be vulnerable. So we've talked about the kind of the emotional the emotional vulnerability that can't be helped. It spills out, it spills over, or the physical vulnerability that is, you know, some might call frailty, you know, that's clear and visible. But even the invisible vulnerability of worry and anxiety around money or those sorts of things, they feel like they're kind of quite accepted vulnerabilities to have. But there is this practice, and I would say it probably comes in that middle age around vulnerability, of declaring one's vulnerability and believing that that is being vulnerable. So I'm not good at this is not the same as being like saying something about vulnerability and your own vulnerability is not actually being vulnerable, that there needs to be some skin in the game.
I think this is such a wonderful point. It took me, you know, I don't know, quite a lot of years of self-observation to pick up that I can speak about how vulnerable I have been, but you really will see me in the moment being vulnerable. Like, I don't like that. That's a different matter.
Yeah.
So I thank you. It's a brilliant point. And I think, you know, that again is one of the blessings of, in my case, I had breast cancer, of going on a journey that you didn't plan on, which is how it felt. You know, one minute you're on the train tracks going somewhere and then somebody switched the points and you're going somewhere else altogether. And I found it a fascinating journey, and obviously I'm still alive and still here, so it's at this point a good journey, but one that I found incredibly valuable, and that was because I was vulnerable and I had to be vulnerable and I had to learn about vulnerability as a strength. As Brené Brown says, you know, how do I make this when I'm physically feeling terrible, or I'm terrified, or I'm frightened about the future, you know, in the moment, how do I now start to work with this with friends and family? And I would say I became a lot more real. You know, many of us grew up with the story of the Velveteen Rabbit and how it was more, you know, finally when enough of you gets rubbed off, your eyes drop off, you're finally real. And I do think sometimes for us as older people, the great gift, if we can bring ourselves through it, aware and vulnerable and whole, then we have, of course, an enormous humanity. In other words, we have been through and seen and experienced an enormous range of things. So when someone appears in front of us, we can see who they are as a human being and where they are on their journey in a way that I think gives context and place for people who we might be listening to. And I think of the listening, you know, the great gift of listening that older people can give, as well as sharing stories, and they listen from somewhere different. And I remember my mum, when my ex-husband ran off with somebody else, and I was outraged and really hurt. And I wept and cried and shouted. And after 2 months of listening, and Mum did nothing and said nothing but listened. And at the end, she said, "Lani, you've always been very successful. I think this will be very good for you." And that was all she said. The most wonderful remark, really. So with that as my example, I think, yes, vulnerability is being vulnerable in the present moment and saying I'm feeling scared, or allowing someone to see that we're not coping. And and raising it, because as you put it so beautifully, some of our vulnerability is external and can be seen, but a lot of it's internal. And to say, you know, I just need a moment because I'm having a panic attack, or I'm actually, when you talk about that illness, that triggers stuff in me, I find that quite hard to hear. Or I'm actually cannot come and do this because I don't have enough money. And that I often feel vulnerable when you talk about that, you know, that I can't join in, just without making it anyone's problem, but just saying how it is for you.
Yes, exactly.
Owning one's vulnerability in the moment. There's another great skill. So thank you for raising that point.
Yeah. You know, I just come back again to David White's words when he talks about the lonely invisibility. You know, ultimately it's you, it's your journey. And we all want to be fortunate enough to be surrounded by loved ones on our journey. But the work, the reflection can only be done by us. The willingness to surrender, to risk, and to, I think, also deal with shame. Right.
Another topic we could go.
Yeah, exactly. All of that, you know, we can have all the support in the world, but ultimately, it's an inside job, right? It's something we have to be willing to see and willing to feel and make our peace with.
And willing to learn from, I think, you know, willing to be a learner still in whatever's going on. And people have mentioned in the chat, you know, the physical, the sort of sense of the risk of the unknown in physical illness. And absolutely, you know, Mum used to say to me, I wonder what's going to carry me off, you know, and it could be any of many unpleasant things. And none of us know till we're faced with that journey, and that bit of the journey and round the corner is the whatever it is or it isn't. And we don't know. So learning to be with risk, and all of these is part of what I want to really cover in the workshop, because we'll be talking about how do we manage transitions, which brings up, of course, vulnerability, because if you suddenly get moved by your family to a rest home, and you now lose your community, then you're vulnerable. Or are you? So how do we start to prepare ourselves for the transitions that inevitably will come with aging? And we can't prepare for all of them, but we can at least look there together holding hands as we are in this conversation.
And I just had a thought, honestly. You know how I think we just sort of like have hit on something, I don't know, typical right at the last second.
Yeah.
But you know how as you get older, one of the tensions that you have is that, like, you feel the same as you always have, like, you know stuff, you know more stuff. But you know, it's like all of you, internal and external, is aging. But there's a part of you, the essential part of you, that's just you, like this, right? And so if we think about where we have experienced vulnerability, and so what our first thoughts might be around, where am I vulnerable? How am I vulnerable? Like, there's going to be a time lag probably, because the data that we've got is out of date. And so what's the kind of internal process that we need to use or draw on or think about to calibrate, where am I actually now, physically, emotionally, mentally, technologically, financially, all of that? Where am I actually now? Do I even have the first clue about my own needs? Or am I going to wait for something to kind of come out from left field and knock me off my feet and go, oh, wow, hang on, where am I? What am I doing? So, yeah, I think there's a part of us that with the aging that needs to kind of, we need some way of catching up with ourselves and recognizing who we are now Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating point, and I think you're so right. And what I want to cover, and spend more time looking at in the workshop is, how do we prepare for something that's in the future? So you're quite right. We're not there, so we can't, because I'm not the person I will be. But at the same time, I love that bit about the youthfulness that we carry with us. And I think of that wonderful quote of Meister Eckhart, verily something along these lines: every day I'm younger. If I carry on like this, it'll be springtime. And I love that sense that somewhere inside us is this perpetually new, fresh, reborn every day entity, being, whatever, spirit, whatever we want to call it. Well, bits of us are dropping off and we're molting with all of the discomfort of that. And how do we hold the complexity? Because part of what as we age, the complexity, you could say, I don't know if it gets any more looking at teenagers. That's a massive complexity too. We deal as human beings with complexity. And how do we deal with it as we age? It's just a really rich inquiry, but I think our time is up. And I
think our time is up too.
You could too, but we're going to have to put an end to it.
As always, we could go on and on and on. Everyone, I hope that this, I see from the comments, a lot of people have been enjoying this conversation. Thank you so much for coming along and just sharing this space with us. It's always really nice just to have as your discussion group, Lani, just to have a kind of a window, a space set aside where we can just come together and have a think and a chat and a reflect. So I hope that this has kind of given you all some thoughts and some ideas about what might be on your personal kind of radar of how you want to start thinking about yourself and where you are at the moment. So really looking forward to next month when Lani and I will be back together to have another conversation related to transitions. And again, if you're interested in the workshop that Lani will be running on transitions, please put your email address in the chat so that you can go on the priority notification list when registrations open, which will just be in the next day or two. So yeah, thanks again. And thanks, Lani. It's always fantastic.
It is. And it's just as wonderful for me because I've had new thoughts in the process of this conversation. So thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. It's just a joy. And I look forward to seeing many of you at the workshop.
Great. All right, everyone, that's a wrap for today. We'll see you next time. Bye now.